Now, the Camino is a good example of precisely this because some of the early writings, anthropological writings about the Camino, done say 25 years ago, one of the things they show there is that, and this is a highly modern, I think, a modern Western conception in many ways, is that actually for some people who go on the Camino, it really is the pathway rather than the arriving at the cathedral, which is the significant point. But the Camino, the pathway, was when you were free, effectively, when you were engaging in what one writer has called anti-structure.
Identify your general why. Why do you want that? Because you want to be more loving, you want to just be more giving, more uplifting. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Professor Simon Coleman is the author of Powers of Pilgrimage and joins me now from Toronto to discuss his beautifully written book and really to also discuss a little bit more broadly what pilgrimage actually means and what it does and so on and so forth. So welcome, Professor Dr. Simon Coleman, to the show.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
So just for our listeners, who is Simon Coleman in simply one sentence?
Okay, lots of nouns here. I think human, probably father, husband, brother, son, but also anthropologist, author, professor, British citizen, Canadian citizen, and finally, I'm going to end with a question mark, possibly a pilgrim.
Very good. Thank you so much. And now, of course, you're teaching actually at the University of Toronto, but you were also teaching in the UK at University of Essex, if I'm not mistaken. So it's such a blessing to have you here. So let's start. And really, what do you mean by pilgrimage first and foremost, to give some context, and then how does it somehow relate to powers?
Yes. So I will give you a sense of what I mean by pilgrimage in a minute, but I'm going to start off by just saying one thing, which is that as an anthropologist, I often go by a maxim that an anthropologist wrote a few years back. And he basically said something like, if you can define something very well, that probably means it's not worth defining. And that what he means by that really is that anthropologists tend to study things which are so difficult to grasp and are so rich, are so varied, that of course you can spend a lifetime studying them. So if I could, in one sense, give you a one-sentence definition of pilgrimage, and then we could all go home and that would be it. But one way of thinking about pilgrimage is to say, of course, that it involves a kind of displacement. It involves people moving from their homes to some other place, having some other kind of experience, often with others whom they may or may not know, and then coming back home again. That's one definition. That's one way of thinking about pilgrimage. What I try and do, I think, in Powers of Pilgrimage, apart from saying that actually there are so many different ways to play or to have varieties of doing what I just described, but also to say that pilgrimage is actually not just about what the pilgrim does. It's about the people who are left at home. It's about the people who are hosting pilgrims. It's about those whom they meet on the way. It's about the institutions that enable pilgrimage. So for me, when you say what is a pilgrimage, it's not just going on the journey. It's actually the whole set of institutions, all of the activities which allow pilgrimage to take place, and then the stories that people tell about what happened to them and the gifts that they give and so on. So really, I'm interested in widening this idea of what pilgrimage actually might be.
That's so interesting, and tell me what you think. But to me, really is almost like a pilgrimage is almost like life. And of course, we can't take it that far, especially when it comes to pilgrimage studies, right? That's a very specific field, and you're doing actually a lot to really further this field in so many ways. And but first and foremost, I want to know a little bit more about you and what really brought you into pilgrimage studies. Really tell us about you and how you ended up studying such a fascinating phenomenon that I think everyone can really take something out of it, really important. And your book is really a gift, I think, to everyone that really wants to learn more and want to go more into specifics. So what brought you really into pilgrimage studies, and more broadly, really to become potentially a pilgrim? Because as we were conversing a few months ago, actually, you told me that you right now are on a pilgrimage, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. So anthropologists tend to be people who like reading books, but also like experiences, and we work out how to combine the two. And my introduction to pilgrimage really occurred when I'd actually finished my PhD, which is on what seemed like a very different subject, which was actually on Pentecostal movements in Sweden. And I was thinking, what am I going to do for my next project? And I happened to be living in Cambridge in England at the time, and I happened to go with some friends of mine to Norfolk. We were driving in a car, and we stopped in a village, and we went into a church in that village. I didn't know anything about this village at all. And I went into what I thought was a normal parish church, an Anglican parish church in England. And I noticed it had this little house in it, very oddly. So I went inside the house, and all of a sudden, I was struck by light, the heat of candles, people crowding around me, and an image with a statue right at the end of this little house, which was of the Virgin Mary holding the child Jesus. And really, that was the shock of that, the surprise of being in this village in an Anglican church, finding this very intense space, a combination of the dark and the light and the statue and the people, I think made me think, "What? Hang on, there's something going on here." What? At that point, I realized that I was in a village called Walsingham, and then I started to say, "Okay, well, let's try find out about Walsingham." And I then discovered that it was actually a very important pilgrimage site in the Middle Ages, and had become an important pilgrimage site in more recent years as well. And then I looked around for anybody who'd written about it, and virtually no anthropologist had written about Walsingham. So I thought, okay, here's my next project. And it was this, and this sense actually of a kind of an affinity, an aesthetic attraction to a place, as well as this kind of initial sense, well, there's something going on here that's intriguing me, that I think actually then, led into effectively what's been decades since of studying pilgrimage. And actually, when I spoke to you, Yannick, I was actually back in Walsingham. I was doing more fieldwork there. So I'd started doing fieldwork there in the 1990s, and I've done fieldwork there on and off for 30 years.
It's so fascinating. And, I don't know if this is coincidence, but I also went on my very first pilgrimage actually this summer. And that was actually before I was communicating. No, I was first communicating with you, and I then ultimately went to a pilgrimage. And it was really my very first time that I really had the courage, because I'm not someone who likes to plan. Yeah. So it was really my mother who really encouraged me, who basically did a little bit like, the research, what I have to take with me, and so on and so forth, because it has been a dream of myself for about like 15 years or so. It started with Paulo Coelho's work, The Alchemist, and I also read his book, The Pilgrimage, where he really vividly describes his journey, from it's the standard, it's Camino de France, that really inspired me, and I found it so profound. And so finally I did it. I went, but I only went like for a week, because just given the time, but it was from Irún to Bilbao, so it was Route del Norte. And so it was just the most amazing experience that I ever had. And ultimately, my mother, she then later on also went on a pilgrimage. She just did it from Portugal, only for a week as well. But it was so powerful. And I'm just every summer when I have time, I will do at least 1 week just to do it. So it's really, really beautiful, and I'm so grateful that you are actually doing this work and that you really share your thoughts so openly about your outstanding written book. So again, thank you so much, Mr. Simon Coleman. And I really want to also tell every reader and listener that he can actually purchase the book on New York University Press. He can get a copy. So this is really something that will inspire you, and then ultimately also take action and actually go on a pilgrimage. So now we go back to really the topic. So that was really a beautiful setting. So what ultimately led you further? Because as you mentioned, it's not just you doing not just now as a professor at the University of Toronto, but you yourself keep basically going on pilgrimages. So is it only vocational practice, or is it also a private practice that you started doing?
I think so much of what we do as ethnographers, as anthropologists, actually is that it combines the two. And one of the wonderful things I think about being an anthropologist, you can also say it's a curse, but you never stop being an anthropologist. No matter what you do, you're always observing, you're always participating. And so for me, a pilgrimage is something that I work on. It's something that I love to discuss and write about. I've been on pilgrimage to Walsingham with my wife. I've taken my children there. So you see the ways in which lives and writing and work combine in all sorts of ways. But I think one of the things that pilgrimage allows me to do, perhaps it did to you as well, I don't know, Yannick, but there's a sense in which going on fieldwork or going on pilgrimage means not just that you're often going to a different place, but you're entering almost a different way of experiencing time and place. When you're walking somewhere, you're engaging in the landscape and the world in a way that you don't normally in the kind of busy lives that many of us lead. You're often meeting people whom you might normally just pass in the street, but you see them in a different kind of way. You have a goal, perhaps, to get to a certain place, but it's the process of going as well, which is powerful, not just intellectually, cognitively, but also emotionally and physically. And I'll just add one more thing there, which is the way, and this is something that I think people need to write about a lot more, which is that pilgrimage is, it's often about what people think of as being the spiritual or the religious and so on. It's also very often about friendship, sociality, and kinship. And I was fascinated by what you said about your mother, because it seems to me that often when we go on pilgrimage, certainly in many parts of the world, not everywhere, we are inspired by family, or we go with family, or we go perhaps to make a prayer for family, or we come back with a message for our family. So these relations of kinship, in one sense, we might leave them behind by going on a journey, but actually they're often there with us all the time. And some of the work I've done has actually been looking at families who go together and asked things like, well, what does it mean when the person whom you've lived with in a house for 20 years, 30 years, suddenly you see them afresh in a pilgrimage site, and perhaps you pray together with them, or you form rituals with them that you won't have done on other occasions in your life. So it's this almost like a transfiguration of one's social relations, a transformation of how you see yourself and how you see others, that I think pilgrimage can offer you, as well as many, many other things.
Yeah, it's really special what you're actually saying, and it brings almost like people closer together. On one hand, yes, you can go together, but on the other hand, in my case, it was actually that my mother also went on her own, and I was actually very surprised and very proud of her, because that's really something out of her comfort zone, really, really. So I was really, really excited, and I was really touched. So that she actually does this now in a in a advanced age. She's not she's elder, I would say, and to me anyways, age is truly, it is a spiritual aging, in the sense that people actually at the spiritual level, at the soul level, in my view, get actually younger. It's just biologically speaking and chronologically speaking, you get older in this sense, right? But I think it's just beautiful how you just mentioned it, how it really brings people together. Now, of course, this can also be a tricky one when you are going with your family, but it is really something different. And you touched on also the community. You said that it's not just yourself, but it is also the institutions, the people. And I want to hear your thoughts about this. Is that there are so many people who volunteer, for example, in Spain, northern Spain, and so it's really, really beautiful. So what, from an anthropological perspective, what does it tell you about people who are willing to spend 2 to 3, 4 weeks of their precious vacation for volunteering in a hostel in order for pilgrims to actually be able to sleep off and be able to afford it? I have to say, it is so touching because I spent an average 10 euros in just amazing places,
I,
surrounded by just amazing people, whether they were spiritual, and we come to this a little bit later, religious, or even, they not necessarily either of them. So I want to have your take on this from an anthropological perspective. What makes people volunteer? I find this beautiful, and it gives me hope.
so I think there are so many different ways of thinking about that. But to begin with, of course, one of the things you're already doing is showing how pilgrimage is not just about going on the journey. It's about these wider institutions. And if you think of a pilgrimage as a way of engaging in, I suppose, ethical actions that are also often away from one's normal place of dwelling, away from one's normal activities, it's a kind of ethical travel with a kind of purpose, if you like. It's a way of becoming a different person temporarily and engaging in actions that perhaps you can't do in normal life. So this exploration of a different self in a different space, possibly not the pilgrim, but the person who effectively is giving to others, associating with anonymous others who become perhaps friends temporarily, is I think a real characteristic of what pilgrimage can do. And I think this sense, I think of it in terms of an ethical frame. I don't necessarily say it's spiritual or religious, but I think the sense of an ethical frame where you're engaging in actions which actually allow you to rediscover parts of yourself or discover new parts of yourself is very important. And I'll just add a further thing to that, a further aspect to that, which is that in some of the work that I've done on pilgrimage sites, which are also cathedrals in England, this is other work that I've done that I also mention in the book. What's fascinating is that if you actually look at the people who keep those cathedrals going, you might think it's clergy, but actually an awful lot of the time, it's those volunteers. It's those volunteers who actually possibly outnumber the paid staff. And who are many of the volunteers in cathedrals? For instance, very often in the English cathedrals that I've studied, it may well be older people who've retired. So you actually engage, you're at a different stage of life. You may not wish to go on the pilgrimage, but you know that you wish to engage with other people, with fellow volunteers, with an institution. And so you're finding a different purpose through engaging in an activity that may be very different from anything that you've done before, but still, but also orientates you towards other people all the time. So the sense of being a volunteer as a gift to others, but also in a sense as a gift to the self, I think is also is something that we might think about in relation to pilgrimage. On the Camino, of course, I think you're describing. What's fascinating is how people who volunteer to help those pilgrims just form, very often, these intense but very, very brief relations with people who are just simply traveling through. And I think there's something special to this sense of being so helpful to people whom not only one doesn't know, but one will probably never meet again. So that sense of helping anonymous others, I think, is a strong characteristic, certainly of a lot of the kind of pilgrimage that you're describing in relation to the Camino.
Yeah, it almost sounds like, to find oneself, you must lose oneself, and that's very powerful. And I think it also has to, as you just describing it, there is a lot of elder people who actually volunteer, right? And that's also a sign of maturity, that it's not just about yourself, because when you're young, of course, it's more about this, but then more and more it's about your family, your community, and really the world that's really beyond your personal scope and really needs. So let's go a little bit more specifically into the power of transforming individual and collective life. And if this is the case, describe, why this is so powerful.
So I think there are lots of reasons why pilgrimage might be powerful. We've talked a little bit about those experiences for the pilgrim, of experiencing a new time, space, and activity, and we've talked about the experience for the volunteer. Again, finding a kind of new aspect for the self in helping others. But I think there are various other ways in which one might think about what I think of as the powers of pilgrimage. And I guess I'll give you two. I could give you many. Okay. One of the things that pilgrimage also does, and this is where power can become civic or political. Pilgrimage often takes masses of people to places that are considered highly significant. A pilgrimage place is typically associated with a founding event, which may have been miraculous, or it may be bringing the relic of a saint, whatever religion one is talking about, to a certain place. And gradually, of course, the accumulation of institutions and history makes this place important, and the accumulation of material culture. But these very often, pilgrimage places take on powers that combine the religious and the political and the civic. And so you have these places that, in a sense, come to represent nations, or come to represent peoples. And if you think about the power of regularly collecting in a place that comes to represent a nation or a region, and if you think about the power of looking around at a place, not just upwards towards the divine figure or a statue, whatever it may be, but across at the masses of people who are also gathered with one. So there's a sense in which you have, I would say, a kind of vertical and horizontal power and a vertical and horizontal perspective coming together in these places. Combine that with the history, combine that with ideas of the miraculous, and you can see how so many of these things can come together to form places that, of course, may be appropriated as powerful political spaces, as well as being religious spaces. I mean, one of the early writings about pilgrimage in the 1950s was done by an anthropologist who talked about the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico City. And one of the things that writer was describing was how actually the Virgin, in one sense, represents the church, but in another sense represents the whole nation. And those people who come to the Virgin are not just the rich or the poor, not just men and women, but actually it's one of those symbols that can bring together the whole of society. Now, people may be reading different things into the symbol, into their idea of the nation. They may be engaging in different kinds of ways, and yet there's the possibility that that one can actually, in some sense, gather around a central symbol. And there's a wonderful phrase from one of the kind of major anthropologists who's written about pilgrimage, somebody called Victor Turner. And he writes about the power of symbols in people's lives. And he talks about a couple of things. One of the things he says is that the powerful symbols that we are orientated around have a fan of meanings. They don't just have one meaning. They have a fan of meanings. So they bring together a set of often associated meanings. And he also talks about how intense ritual, and often pilgrimage, of course, involves intense ritual, not always, but often. He says it somehow brings together the obligatory with the desirable. In other words, it makes those things that we need, in a sense, to believe or adhere to be members of a given society, it somehow makes them desirable to us as well. We want to do those things which bring us together. This, of course, is both the power, the positive power, and the negative power of pilgrimage. One, because it can have, if you like, an ideological effect, which can be used for good or ill. But when it's used for good, of course, it implies the bringing together of diverse populations oriented around a symbol that somehow embodies a fan of meaning.
You're talking about meaning, and I find this so interesting because to me, like, humans are really meaning seekers and meaning makers. So what does give you meaning in life? How do you make meaning in your own life?
I'll say one thing about meaning in general first, and then I'll give you an answer. So I think one of the things that anthropologists are interested in is what, of course, what we mean by meaning, and there's so much that one could say about that. But I think one of the interesting things that pilgrimage indicates to us is that meaning is not just what goes on in the head or what we might actually be able to express linguistically or cognitively. Pilgrimage actually requires us to do things, to act in certain ways, to orientate ourselves towards other people and spaces. And so this sense actually of experiencing either a new place or a known place that one has come back to, physically and emotionally, is, I think, as powerful as any of these other senses of what that we might imply by talking about meaning. Now, for me, I think in a way I gave you a kind of hint before about what gives me meaning. I think one of the things that I find very striking about the work that I do is that there really isn't much of a division in one sense between the work and the life. I'm able to bring my family and friends into the work and vice versa. And the work, I first really wanted to become an anthropologist. I would say when I was about 12 or 13. So there's a sense in which there's a clear resonance between what I do as an anthropologist and these experiences that I'm describing. And I think for me, they combine two things that are important to me. One of them is that they require me to go and reflect and to write, and in a sense to be on my own. What we do a lot of the time as anthropologists is simply sit down and write and stare at a screen or stare at a pen or whatever it is we're staring at. But also, of course, it requires us to have experiences with others, but also experiences that are all about taking us out of ourselves. So I've done things as an anthropologist that I never would have expected to have done, been to places. So I'm thinking about, visiting prayer cities in Nigeria where you look at an arena that's 3 kilometers long. Or I think about ending up in this Norfolk village in this tiny little shrine. Or I think about, some of the other work I've done in, say, hospitals in the north of England. So that, I'd never have expected that I'd be hanging around talking to people in, say, chaplaincies in a hospital in the northeast of England, or in this prayer camp, and yet somehow these senses of discovering who you are through displacing yourself and asking, well, how can I understand another way of life, and how do I actually learn something about myself as I learn how other people see the world, is something that I think is central to who I am, as well as what I do.
You also mentioned that it shapes to some extent identities and also communities through pilgrimage at the individual but also collective level. So explain to us what you mean by this specifically.
Yes. Let me give you an example from my own fieldwork. So I mentioned that I work on a pilgrimage site called Walsingham, and that's associated with a tiny village in Norfolk, which is in the eastern part of England. It's just 5 miles south of the coast. And this is a site that has two major shrines in it. One is associated with Anglican pilgrimage. One is associated with Roman Catholic pilgrimage. Now, what's interesting, I think, about Walsingham is, despite the fact that it's a tiny place, historically it's very resonant for both Roman Catholics and Anglicans. And so what really happens is that people will go individually or with families to this place, and you'll experience it with your family as well. But there are also particular times of year when you will go with your parish or your diocese, and you will gather together And this tiny place that normally has less than 1,000 people in it, fewer than 1,000 people in it, suddenly has 10,000 people, whatever it may be, all gathered in one place. And you look around and you realize that, yes, well, I may be a certain kind of Anglican, an Anglo-Catholic, and where there may not be very many of us in the parish that I inhabit in the northeast of England. But when I come to Walsingham, I realize that actually I'm part of a national movement. So it's not just that you've traveled there. It's not just that you've displaced yourself. It's also that you actually literally see your community laid out in front of you. And when I go on some of these national pilgrimages, I try and meet up with groups who are all gathered together. They have a picnic by a shrine, and they're all gathered together, in a sense, in their small groups, eating together. But of course, they're also moving around these groups and greeting each other and saying, "Lovely to see you. Saw you from, remember you from last year, or I remember you from 10 years ago." So there's a sense in which you've got this this kind of annual meeting, which is also a kind of reinforcement of who one is, and a reminder that even though you may be part of a small, intimate group most of the time, there is a wider group that you are part of. And of course, this is much more powerful than just simply seeing something on screen or writing about it, because you know that everybody has made the effort to coordinate, to be in the same place at the same time. This will happen each year. And so again, you build up memory. You say, well, I've been coming for 10 years, or I've been coming for 20 years, I've been coming for 30. It becomes who you are. And those meetings that you have not with people at the shrine become part of your own biography. And again, I'm interested in what happens when you go with people once more whom you might have seen in your parish church every week for 10, 20 years. But you go with them to Walsingham and you learn to see each other through a different frame, but a wider frame, where you see that you're part of a wider movement, but also a wider frame associated with what the shrine means to you. The shrine is associated very much with the Virgin Mary and the Annunciation. So you can frame yourself and you can frame others in these ways that are both fresh, but also, if you've been coming for many years, also familiar and powerful to you.
And this is really what you mean, if I'm not mistaken, by the journey can really serve as a catalyst for really deepen faith and commitment. So why do you think it does really potentially deepen faith and commitment? And how have you experienced it as a researcher, but also as someone who is a committed pilgrim?
So I think various ways to think about this. So one way is that it's very common for people nowadays to assume that, for instance, pilgrims in the past, say medieval European pilgrims, just as an example, viewed the journey itself as being a vital part of the pilgrimage. Now, in practice, I'm going to summarize much discussion here very quickly. In practice, it seems highly likely that actually for many of those pilgrims, they just wanted to get to the shrine, Rome, Compostela, Walsingham, by avoiding, avoiding danger, avoiding death. They just wanted to get there and to be able to get back safely. So this sense that the journey is inherent to what a pilgrimage means is itself, I think, a relatively modern idea, partly to do with the ways in which we try and conceptualize meaningful journeys in our lives. So I'm not going to mention, although the journey can be significant, and of course making the effort on the journey, the physical effort, and the slowing down of one's life, that can all be very important. But I think I'm also going to say two other things, which I mentioned before. One is this sense of displacement and reframing. I think the sense that actually pilgrimage allows us to almost rescale our lives, to think of who we are, but to place ourselves in a different meaningful location. And so it's in that sense, of course, people say there are all sorts of parallels between, say, pilgrimage and tourism, and there certainly can be. And it seems to me that actually to divide the two is often very problematic. But if you think about this idea of pilgrimage as being a kind of a journey with an ethical purpose, a journey where you're becoming conscious of yourself and others and the landscape in ways that are quite special, which is actually very similar, I should say, to ethnography. When you're doing ethnography, you're paying attention in a different kind of way. It seems to me all of these forms of attention and absorption help to make the experience often, again, not always, often more powerful. Now, sometimes, of course, people can switch between deep attention and deep inattention. And so we shouldn't make too much of this. People can switch frames very, very quickly. And both of those frames can be significant to them. And pilgrimage is not just about being serious, it's also about being playful. So part of discovering new things about yourself might be learning to play, learning to experiment, being ironic about oneself or others. It's not just deadly serious and deadly earnest. I think that would be very problematic. But all of these things are happening at the same time as one is coming to realize that one is in a landscape that is also appreciated by others as being deeply significant. But other pilgrims are also regarding this place as being a place that's significant to them. And so there's a kind of curious sense, I would say, of both intimacy and anonymity that you see in many pilgrimage sites that you don't necessarily, I mean, sometimes you do, but, you may well not know the other people who are with you in a shrine, but somehow you are gathered together for what at least appears to be a common framework of action. And so, and of course, you are physically next to them, and that you may be engaging in activity which is deeply meaningful for you, just as you know that the person next to you is also engaged in those actions. So again, this sense, as I say, of the anonymous and the intimate, I think is a really powerful characteristic of what pilgrimage can do. I'm just going to add one more thing, though. Again, one of the things that I'm interested in is not just what goes on at a shrine. One of the things that Powers of Pilgrimage does, especially in the second half of the book, is to say, don't just assume that we need to look at what happens in the most central part of a sacred space. So when I go to Walsingham, I spend a lot of time sitting in cafes, going to pubs, looking at what people do in the street, even looking at what people do in car parks. So there's a sense in which actually being next to a sacred place, being in the penumbral part of a sacred place, can itself have a powerful effect. One may not be engaging in conventional ritual, but one is aware that one is in the perimeter or the penumbra of this place. And so it's those kinds of activities, which are often highly creative, as well as being highly playful, often done, almost spontaneously, I'm also fascinated by. And it seems to me we also need to be looking at those kinds of activities as well when we look at pilgrimage.
Yeah, as you mentioned, really, it shapes, as you mentioned in the book, economies, right? Landscapes, and really its surrounding. And so it's really profound. And I want to just go back a little bit in terms of pilgrimage, because what you just said was really interesting. And I was oblivious about this fact, but you said it was never really considered the journey itself, the journey and the goal, right? Now, that's a very modern conception of pilgrimage, right? So, give us a taste. Why do you think pilgrimage in general becomes more and more popular again? So, what does it tell us about human beings, from your perspective as an anthropologist?
I think I'll just say about the journey, it depends on which historical pilgrimage one is talking about, but we can't assume always that the journey was significant. But if you ask me why do I think pilgrimage in the contemporary period is so significant, I think there are lots of reasons. Some of them very banal, and some of them, interesting in different kinds of ways. The banal reason is that it's a lot easier to travel, and so more people have many more opportunities to go to places. And of course, we can also see the ways in which places themselves become marketed in new ways. And in an increasingly global world, people are aware of other places in new kinds of ways. And it's interesting, by the way, that pilgrimage sites and those who run them are more aware of other pilgrimage sites and therefore borrow from each other. And we talked about the Camino model, of borrowing this model of these long routes that head across landscapes is one that actually you see borrowed in other parts of the world. It's not just across Europe, but you see caminos effectively in Australia, for instance, and Brazil. So there are those kinds of reasons. But I think possibly more interesting is the way in which, if we take pilgrimage as being often about movement and giving an ethical framework to movement, I think what's interesting is how, for a lot of people, movement is both an opportunity and a problem in the contemporary world. Often some people can't move at all, and other people are simply spending their lives moving too quickly. Now, one of the things that pilgrimage does is that it almost modulates or reframes this problem or this opportunity associated with movement in a way that makes it, I guess, for some people more productive, more controllable, as well as allowing us to rediscover things about ourselves. And what do I mean by that? I'll give you two examples. The Camino example would be, the stressed business person who spends most of their time jetting around the world thinking, oh, I don't want to be on another flight. Of course, that process of walking, of slowing down, you're still moving, but you're giving movement a different kind of meaning. You're a set of associations. You're rediscovering your body. Let me give you a completely different example, which is to look at the way. There's a wonderful example of a shrine in Miami that's described by a historian called Thomas Tweed, which is a shrine set up by Cuban refugees, effectively, kind of migrants from Cuba, those people who fled Cuba, but who set up a shrine that becomes effectively almost kind of recreation of a home that once lost, but now it's in Miami. Now, that shrine itself has images of people, for instance, in boats on the sea, experiencing the dangers of being a refugee or somebody fleeing or a migrant. And what in effect that pilgrimage can do is not just recreate home, recreate a sense of one's belonging to a place that's distant, but it can also, in a sense, I would argue, it can reframe the original event of experiencing the dangers of feeling oneself forced out of a place into a boat. It reframes it richly so that we can we remember that original journey, that original dangerous journey, but we reframe it through a ritual that takes place every year or regularly, that allows us to reflect on it, but give it a kind of a ritual frame, almost a kind of domestication of the danger, not forgetting it, but also ritualizing it. And of course, making it part of a collective memory of that diasporic community. So you can see how pilgrimage can play with movement and place and identity in all sorts of different kinds of ways. And these ways inevitably take on significance in the context of a globalizing transnational world, but also a world where some people feel simply stuck, aware that others can move, but we can't. And there's a wonderful example, again, somebody who's written about those people, for instance, in Morocco, who can't go on the Hajj. They can't afford it, or they can't actually, they're not chosen to go on the Hajj to Saudi Arabia. But effectively, they can recreate the Hajj in their home. So again, this sense of recreating the possibility of movement, of looking elsewhere, even when you can't physically move yourself, can be very powerful.
It's almost what you're also saying is that, rituals are so important for human beings to really process, life in a very meaningful way. So, I'm curious what you think about this, and you just touched on it, is that there are a lot of people who are very, very aware about the commercialization of especially El Camino, and especially people who volunteer, they're really concerned. And that's one of the reasons when I talk to them why they come, because really they want to make sure that it will remain what it is. And so what's your take on that, and what do you think is the danger if we move away from the way that it's done now to a more commercialization of, for example, specifically El Camino?
So one of the things I would say about that is that the idea that pilgrimage sites have to be in somehow pure, kept away from markets or economic actions, is, I would argue, again, probably quite a kind of contemporary, in many ways, quite a certain kind of Christian idea. If you look at pilgrimages elsewhere, there are very different ideas about what is appropriate, and we can't assume that pilgrimage sites are regarded as being, in inverted commas, somehow to be kept pure from the commercial or the economic. There are all sorts of ways in which actually, historically, and in various parts of the world, markets and pilgrimages come together. They have an affinity for each other. And we might think about the ways in which, let me give you an example that can kind of confound some of these distinctions. You know, when people go to Walsingham or go to many sites, they go to the shop, the shrine shop, and they can buy an image, or they might buy a statue. They pay with money, they pay with a credit card, whatever it may be. What do they then do? They may well go to a priest and they say, "Will you please bless this, Father?" If it's a father in the Catholic shrine. Effectively, do we see that as a commercial transaction, or do we see that as a ritual or religious transaction? Of course, you can see that they're all combined. And there's a sense in which actually all shrines need to be able to survive economically as well as ritually and in other kinds of ways. So in practice, you can see the ways in, and I could say much more about this, but there are all sorts of ways in which actually the economic and the ritual and the religious combine together at pilgrimage sites. Now, having said that, of course, what's fascinating about pilgrimage is that it allows, I would say, certainly the larger pilgrimage sites tend to allow a huge range of economic transactions to take place. So the Camino itself, in certain contexts, may look deeply touristic, deeply commercial. My argument would be, as an anthropologist, don't see that as being something we need to remove. Say, try and understand it. Try and understand how it's emerged, and understand how it coexists and possibly is mutually dependent upon other people who see the Camino in very different ways and see their volunteering as a way of removing themselves from a commercial, capitalist, neoliberal economy, whatever it may be. In practice, institutionally, probably they rely on each other. And so we can't assume that you can simply remove one without changing what the Camino might actually be as an entity. And this is part of, again, my argument that when we look at pilgrimage, we look at the whole thing. We don't just look at some single idealized view of what we think the pilgrimage should be. As an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, I say, how do we actually understand what it is? How do I extend my understanding of it into all sorts of frames and locations that people might not think to look? And it seems to me it's extending that sense of what pilgrimage is, where it is, how it's understood. That's all a way of extending what I call the powers of pilgrimage.
Beautifully said. And, to me, this is always so important because to me, there is not really an issue with that because, even if you look at religious texts or specifically the Bible, there is always a certain sacrifice that you have to make, right? And I truly believe that sacrifice it's really what life is. And that's why, for example, I find the Bible such an incredible book because it describes human nature and what we need in such a poignant way that truly makes so sense. I give you an example. So when we do something, it's like if you want to really do something, if you spend some money, you will actually focus on it and will actually push through, right? Because your attention, your focus, and literally your energy, money as a form of energy really goes there. And so it's important. So why do you think there is always this problem of so many people who find like, well, you should never ever charge for something that is religious because it serves a higher purpose and therefore you should not charge it? I personally do not find it problematic. But I also have to say that initially I didn't think this way as well. I was very because I was very ignorant. I was very ignorant about religions in general and really its purpose. That I thought like, no, there's no way that you somehow can make money out of that. And this is really also leads me to another question, which I find really interesting, and I want to know your answer as well. Is religion and culture, they're so intertwined, and culture wouldn't exist if there will not be religion. In my view, religion is the very, very backbone that really allowed culture to emerge ultimately. Well, simply because we didn't have, like, I think it's a pretty new concept of looking at human phenomenon through a poorly anthropological lens. So there are two questions. The first one, really, where does it come from that people think like money and religion should be completely separated, such as in the Camino, for example? And then the second question, the relationship between religion and anthropology.
So I'm going to try and combine those two. There are many ways to answer your question, but so one of the ways we might think about, certainly the way anthropologists have thought about religion, is to say that actually the idea of separating religion off from culture is itself quite a kind of specific uh, uh, way of thinking about the way in which both religion and culture works. And in many ways, you can see it emerging from the history of certainly kind of European conceptualizations of religion, the separation of religion from the state, this idea that it's possible to be secular, the idea that you should separate off realms of politics and economics from realms of the religious. And the idea, therefore, that religion itself becomes this specialized thing, this specialized way of acting towards each other. We might think of this as being universal. In practice, if you look cross-culturally and across and certainly historically, it's very difficult to sustain this idea that religion has to be seen as this separate sphere. Of course, if you do see it as a separate sphere, then you start to say, well, actually, what makes religion special? How do we, I'm going back to that word I used earlier, how do we purify it, make it pure from everyday action, economic action, political action? You start to create this idea that religion has to inhabit a separate economic realm where actually conventional economics doesn't work. Now, in practice, of course, as I say, if you look cross-culture, this doesn't work. And even if you look at pilgrimage sites, the way in which they function, actually, there are so many different ways in which to engage with them economically. Now, if we then say, however, that what does a pilgrimage site do? There's a fascinating example of the ways in which a pilgrimage site can manifest both of these kinds of economies at the same time. I'm going to call them the charitable economy, and I'm going to call them the commercial economy in the same place. If you look at the kind of some of the places I've worked on, some of the English cathedrals, they are both places of worship and they're heritage sites, they're tourist sites. And there's an endless debate amongst many people who look after them. Well, should we charge people for entry to come in? And there's one argument, one strategy, which says, well, if you're coming as a kind of tourist, you should pay X amount. But if you come and say, I'm here to pray, then you shouldn't have to pay at all. Now that looks fine. It looks as though there's an obvious separation. In practice, of course, if you go there to pray, the chances are you're going to give a donation. That itself is an economic transaction, but it's not one that is imposed upon you. It's one that you have decided to make as a gift to the shrine. And if you like to use the word that you've used before, it's a kind of sacrifice. The etymology of sacrifice, by the way, is to make sacred. There's a sense in which you're making that economic transaction of, well, I was going to say putting the coins in the box. Nowadays, it's probably waving your credit card in front of a screen. But you're making that economic transaction a sacrificial gift through the fact that you have chosen to make it and you've associated it with prayer. But of course, how do you, in practice, somebody might look like an obvious pilgrim because they come to pray. But some people say when we come to a cathedral, we don't know whether we're a tourist. We don't know whether we're a pilgrim. We're not sure who we are. And this sense of trying to make people choose between these two identities, I think, is asking people to make divisions that often, in practice, they don't know. Life is much messier than an apparent division between the straightforwardly secular commercial and the apparently sacrificial religious. And that's good for us as anthropologists. It goes back to my definition, this idea that a definition shouldn't be too easy. Because life is messy, life becomes interesting, but it's associated with a fan of meanings that people like me get to analyze.
Fascinating. Tell us a little bit about the loss of religion in pilgrimage, because that's also, for some, that's to some extent problematic. What is your take on this?
So some people say that, pilgrimages now are just, effectively they're losing their religious meaning, and invert whatever that actually means. They're becoming mere tourism. And often this is associated, I would say, with debates in what we call the Western world, where those kind of debates about the secularism and secularization, I think, are most evident. Now, in practice, again, life is much more complicated than that. One of the things that you find, one of the things I find fascinating about pilgrimage in the West is that some people go on pilgrimage or go to pilgrimage sites who would never attend a church or a temple or whatever it may be, a regular site of worship. So in practice, their experience of so-called, obviously, religious spaces is often actually through pilgrimage rather through going to a conventional space. And when they go on these pilgrimages, they're often associated with journeys that take on particular meaning because we're there with family. They've made an effort to go, or they discover aspects of the journey that appear to be religious for themselves in ways that they'd never anticipated. And I find this in Walsingham as well, that actually one of the things that happens at Walsingham is that you might be dragged to a shrine at Walsingham by a relative who is themselves very pious, and you may go there under protest. Now, what is it that happens there? Sometimes I have been with people where people, under these kinds of circumstances, where people have simply refused to get out of the car to go into the shrine and say, "No, I'm not taking part. That's it." But more interesting are those occasions when, of course, because you're going with somebody whom you know or value, you actually will engage in the place. And that engagement with the place may not bring you to an experience of some kind of with some kind of divine entity, but it does actually engage you with that person. It engages you with history. It engages you with a sense that actually here is a place that is significant to so many people. Now, in practice, it seems to me that these kinds of engagements, they may seem more casual, they may seem more spontaneous, they may seem accidental. This actually is probably the experience of possibly, I don't know whether it's the majority, but there's certainly some places that we call pilgrimage sites. The majority of people have these semi-detached experiences with what's actually going on. I don't want to dismiss those experiences. I don't want to say that they are obviously religious or secular. It seems to me that those are inappropriate terms to describe actions that are, I would say, about ritual engagement and ritual creativity. What we've agreed, I think, is that ritual is important for people, even people who would see themselves as secular. This sense of being able to frame certain activities in one's life in ways that allow you to reflect on a certain activity or a place that may set apart time. Most people, in some sense, have those kinds of occasions. Where you are inventing or you're somehow investing in some kind of ritual that may be with others. And so let's think about pilgrimages as places that attract all sorts of ritual engagement. Let's say therefore that we can stop talking about just the religious and the secular, and think about them acting in a different frame, a different way of engaging people as they displace themselves, as they move from home.
That's beautiful said. And we are almost done, but I just want to ask you about this, what you're just mentioning, because what happened to me when I was young, there was no way, religion was somehow attractive to me. And actually, people who wanted to introduce me and brought me to church, actually, the opposite actually happened. It just kind of I got further away from it because I thought like that somehow suspicious. And well, I was basically let loose. Then ultimately I turned back and I started really make off my ignorance and studying those texts, which ultimately led me to a wonderful faith that I now cultivate, which I find is so critical for me personally. On the other hand, there's also my family, for example, background is not at all religious, but I myself, I am really now, and I'm so grateful to have really this grace to participate in a bigger community, and something that truly gives me really meaning in life, and through which I can really see the world. And the last thing, second last question is really, why do you think there is such an emphasis on spirituality and not religion today, and especially when it comes to pilgrimage?
So again, I think it depends which part of the world that we're looking at. In some ways, that is a question that I think emerges most strongly in what we think of as the Western world, where the idea of being secular, or I think, is very prevalent, certainly among some people. But I think it goes back. One of the things that pilgrimage does, and this is something that actually is a whole stream of writing about pilgrimage that we haven't even managed to discuss so far. But if you think about pilgrimage as being a movement away from the familiar, away from everyday structures, which it sometimes is, there's a sense in which what pilgrimage is also doing is that it's allowing you to move yourself away from even conventional religious forms. You're moving away from the conventional temple or church or whatever it may be. The clergy or the shrine administrators whom you meet may be people whom you know, but they may well be people whom you don't know, who don't know you. So there's a kind of curious sense in which actually you can free yourself from what looked like kind of conventional institutions by going on pilgrimage, because you're going to a fresh place. People don't necessarily know you. You don't necessarily have to fit in conventional kinds of ways. Now, the Camino is a good example of precisely this, because some of the early writings, anthropological writings about the Camino, done say 25 years ago, one of the things they show there is that, and this is a highly modern, I think, a modern Western conception in many ways, is that actually for some people who go on the Camino, it really is the pathway rather than the arriving at the cathedral, which is the significant point. The trouble with the cathedral for some pilgrims is that you're entering again a structural space, a space that represents the church as it tries to wrap itself around you architecturally and ritually. But the Camino, the pathway, was when you were free, effectively, when you were engaging in what one writer has called anti-structure. You're moving, you're away from the institution, you're able to move in certain kinds of ways where you have a much more of an autonomy. Now, this, of course, fits with this idea, as many people see it, of the spiritual but not religious. If you associate the religious with ideas of religious institutions, hierarchies, people who are telling you what to do, the spiritual as being much more of an exploratory realm, where effectively you are not bound by institutions, but you are engaging in community with others. There are different ways of thinking about this, but I think this is one of the reasons why the Camino itself has become such a resonant contemporary symbol of pilgrimage. The Camino, as it is currently practiced, I should say, especially from the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. That sense of being able to be spiritual but not religious, or to engage in an action that is so different from the everyday without having to commit to being a Christian or whatever it may be, is something that I think resonates very powerfully today. So pilgrimage, ironically, becomes a way of engaging with at least ritual forms without necessarily being conventionally religious.
That's so interesting, and this, of course, is a whole other discussion we will hopefully have one day later. But to me, it's always like it's really the structure ultimately that helps you to really grow at the spiritual level, because without some structure, without this structure, without some guidance, it's actually really hard. I think to some extent, discipline and structure will actually set you free and really will accelerate this kind of growth. But there are obviously very different ways of seeing this. So the last question is really about what makes you most alive when it comes to your personal pilgrimage, when you go on a pilgrimage, and what do you enjoy most, and what do you really get out of it on a personal but also at the familial level, let's say?
I think two or three things. I think one of the things that I love about pilgrimage is that I find at its best, it can be deeply absorbing. So you can become engaged in something, and indeed with others, in a way that allows you, in a sense, to forget other aspects of your life. One person, well, actually, who's used borrowing the term, has talked about this as a kind of flow experience. So there's a sense in which pilgrimage can become this deeply social but also deeply embodied experience where you become absorbed. And the fact that you might be becoming absorbed in this way, I'm just thinking about a procession that I engaged in with my wife, say a year and a half ago, that you're doing this with somebody who is so well known to you, but somehow there's this experience of both engaging in this displacement together, I think is very, very powerful. But I think the other thing that pilgrimage does to me, it's the same thing I think as anthropology does for me, which is that one of the things that anthropologists always, I think, feel about the world is that it could always have been otherwise. So we can never take for granted what we're doing where we are. So the fact that you and I are sitting here speaking a certain language, wearing certain clothes, making certain assumptions, ethnography, anthropology always reminds you of the possibility of doing something utterly different, thinking about the world in a very, very different way. And there are times when I do field work, as I say, when I find myself doing something and I think, hang on a sec, how on earth did I find myself here with these people doing this? And I suddenly think, well, this is a reminder to you that actually you have displaced yourself, and that you may not know what's going on, but you're reminding yourself that actually things can always be different. The otherwise is always possible. Of course, some people are stuck in certain frameworks, but you have to be aware that the way you live is not the only way that people have lived, and the way people do live. And so this possibility of a suddenly radically different reframing of who one might be and of who humans are, I think is very, very powerful. And you get this in both pilgrimage and you get this in ethnography more generally as well.
Professor Simon Coleman, what a blessing to have you here on the show. You're truly a blessing to me and really to the world. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it very much.
Professor Simon Coleman. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.